He thought she was just another black woman, easy to intimidate, easy to silence. But what he didn't know, she was a decorated Navy SEAL, a war hero, a woman who had faced real enemies on the battlefield. And now, she's facing her biggest fight yet, in a courtroom against a corrupt cop who thought he could lie and get away with it. But today the truth is about to destroy him. What happens when a soldier trained to expose the enemy is forced to fight the system meant to protect her? Where are you watching from? Drop your country and city in the comments. Let's see how far the truth can travel. If you believe in justice, in truth, and in powerful storytelling that exposes corruption, hit that subscribe button now. Buckle up. This isn't just a trial, it's a war for justice. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut with a dull thud, locking in the charged atmosphere. Every seat was filled, journalists gripping their notepads, spectators whispering behind cupped hands, uniformed officers lining the benches in silent solidarity with one of their own. Tension pulsed through the air, thick and suffocating. At the prosecution's table, Officer Colton Shaw sat stiffly, his uniform crisp, his jaw tight. He looked every bit the model officer, clean-cut, blonde, square-jawed, the image of law enforcement integrity. But beneath the polished exterior, a twitch at the corner of his mouth betrayed his nerves. A few feet away, Zariah Monroe sat motionless, hands folded, eyes steady, her charcoal grey pantsuit neat and professional. To the untrained eye, she was just another defendant, calm, composed, and unremarkable. But Zariah Monroe was far from ordinary. What Officer Shaw didn't realize, what no one in this room besides her lawyer knew, was that Zariah wasn't just another civilian. She was a former Navy SEAL, a lieutenant commander, 15 years of service, 3 tours, a Silver Star, a record so classified most wouldn't believe it if they saw it. And now she was on trial, accused of resisting arrest and assaulting a police officer. "All rise!" the Trevor's voice rang out, snapping the courtroom into motion. Zariah stood smoothly, her movements controlled. She knew exactly what they saw. A black woman accused of attacking a white officer. The optics alone were enough to put the system against her. But she wasn't here to play the victim. She was here to expose the truth. "The court is now in session," Judge Camilla announced. "Case number 2023 CR-7845, City of Rochester versus Zariah Monroe. Charges: resisting arrest and assault on a peace officer." At the prosecution's table, District Attorney Daniel Porter rose. Polished, confident, a man used to winning. "The people are ready, Your Honor." Besides Zariah, her attorney, Tristan Wells, stood as well, a sharp, experienced defense lawyer with no patience for injustice. "The defense is ready, Your Honor." Judge Camilla nodded. "Proceed." As the preliminary matters wrapped up, Zariah met Shaw eyes. He was watching her, waiting for her to show fear, doubt, anything that would justify his version of events. But she gave him nothing. He had no idea who he was up against. Porter strode toward the jury, his tone smooth and authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is simple," he began. "On the night in question, Officer Shaw responded to a disturbance call. He found the defendant loitering outside a closed business. When he approached to question her, she became aggressive, refused to identify herself, and then, without provocation, attacked him. During the struggle, she reached for his firearm, forcing him to subdue her. A pause, a calculated breath. This case is not about race, it is about the rule of law." Zariah barely blinked. She had seen this playbook before. The prosecution would paint her as a threat, dangerous and unpredictable. The truth didn't matter, only the narrative they could sell, but she wasn't here to let them win. Tristan Wells stood, buttoned his jacket, and took his place before the jury. "The prosecution wants you to believe this case is simple," he said, his voice calm but firm. "That an officer acting in good faith was attacked without cause by a woman with no history of violence. A woman who, by coincidence, happens to have an impeccable record, a distinguished military career, and a spotless background." He let that sink in. "But what if I told you there's more to this story? What if I told you that the body camera footage that should have captured everything, suddenly malfunctioned at the exact moment Officer Shaw claims he was attacked? A shift in the room, a ripple of doubt. Wells's voice lowered, controlled. "This isn't just about one officer and one civilian. This is about a system that makes assumptions, a system that protects its own at the expense of the truth." Zariah remained still, letting the words settle. She had fought on battlefields, led men into war zones, made life or death decisions under fire. And yet, here she was, fighting another war. A war not waged with weapons, but with lies, bias, and a system built to break people like her. Not this time. She wouldn't let them write her story. She would make sure they heard the truth. And she would make sure they never forgot her name. The courtroom was silent, save for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Officer Colton Shaw adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and straightened his posture as he took the witness stand. His uniform was immaculate, his badge polished to a shine, but there was something beneath the surface, a tension in his shoulders, a flicker of unease in his eyes. District Attorney Daniel Porter approached with calculated confidence, standing before the jury as he addressed his witness. "Officer Shaw, please state your name and rank for the record." Shaw nodded, folding his hands on the wooden railing in front of him. "Colton Shaw, Senior Officer, Rochester Police Department. And how long have you served in law enforcement?" 12 years. His voice was steady, firm. "I've responded to hundreds of calls in that time. I've de-escalated dangerous situations, protected this community, and upheld the law to the best of my ability." Porter gave a slight nod, setting the stage. "Let's discuss the night in question. Can you walk us through what happened?" Shaw exhaled, then leaned forward slightly. "At approximately 10:42 p.m., I received a disturbance call, a report of a suspicious person loitering outside a closed business on Lexington Avenue. I arrived on the scene to find the defendant, Zariah Monroe, standing near the entrance. His eyes flicked towards Zariah as if expecting a reaction. She gave him none. She simply sat, still and unreadable, her gaze locked on him, watching." Porter continued, "And what happened next?" Shaw squared his shoulders. "I approached her, identified myself, and asked what she was doing there. She refused to answer. I then asked for identification. Again, she refused. Her demeanor was hostile, confrontational. She was acting erratically, and I became concerned for my safety." A murmur ran through the courtroom, barely audible but unmistakable. It was the first crack in his testimony, subtle, but there. Zariah remained motionless, her expression unchanged, but Wells, her lawyer, smirked slightly, already sensing the weakness in Shaw's narrative. Porter ignored the reaction and pressed forward. "Hostile? In what way?" Shaw hesitated, then cleared his throat. She raised her voice, stepped toward me in an aggressive manner. When I attempted to detain her for refusing to comply with a lawful order, she resisted. Porter nodded, guiding him along. "And at what point did the situation turn physical?" Shaw's grip tightened on the railing. "She shoved me, hard. I nearly lost my footing. Then," he paused for effect, "then she reached for my service weapon. I had no choice but to take control of the situation. I had to restrain her before she became a danger to herself or to me." The jury stirred, processing his words. The image was clear, an officer, just doing his job, being forced to defend himself. A black woman, angry and aggressive, attacking a man in uniform. It was a familiar narrative, a predictable one, too predictable. Tristan Wells stood. "Objection, Your Honor." Judge Camilla looked over her glasses. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that we're getting a carefully rehearsed story rather than the truth." Porter turned, exasperated. "Your Honor," but Camilla raised a hand. "Mr. Wells, you'll have your chance to cross-examine." Objection overruled. "Continue, Mr. Porter." Porter shot Wells a look before refocusing on Shaw. "Did you feel that your life was in danger?" "Yes," Shaw answered immediately. "When someone reaches for an officer's firearm, the situation escalates to a deadly threat. I had to act fast. I subdued her, called for backup, and took her into custody." Silence. Zariah hadn't moved an inch. She sat perfectly still, watching Shaw, reading him. His breathing was steady, but his fingers twitched slightly against the railing. His jaw was set, but a bead of sweat formed near his temple. He was lying. Not entirely, no, he had convinced himself of enough of the truth to make it sound real, but he was embellishing, twisting, framing himself as the victim when he had never been in danger. Zariah knew, and Shaw knew that she knew. Wells leaned over and whispered, "He's slipping." Zariah nodded slightly. She could see it. Shaw wasn't unraveling just yet, but the threads were loose, ready to be pulled apart. Porter turned back to the jury. "Officer Shaw, did you at any point use excessive force?" "No," he said firmly. "I followed protocol. I did what was necessary to ensure the safety of everyone involved." Another ripple of murmurs. This time, Judge Camilla tapped her gavel lightly. "Order!" Shaw exhaled, glancing toward his fellow officers in the gallery. Their expressions were unreadable, but their presence alone bolstered him. Porter took one last step forward. "Officer Shaw, for clarity, did Zariah Monroe ever comply with your orders that night?" "No," Shaw answered without hesitation. "She refused every directive I gave her." Zariah's lawyer rose again. "No further questions?" Porter smiled. "No further questions." Camilla turned to Wells. "Your witness, Mr. Wells." Wells stood, buttoning his jacket as he approached the stand. His movements were slow, deliberate. He stopped just short of Shaw, hands clasped in front of him. Then, after a pause, "Officer Shaw," Wells said, his tone almost casual, "you've been in law enforcement for 12 years, correct?" Shaw nodded. "That's right. And in that time, you've written how many reports? Thousands?" "Several thousand, yes." Wells nodded, as if impressed. "And would you say you're good at writing reports?" Shaw hesitated. I'd say I'm accurate." Wells smiled slightly. "Of course you are. That's what makes your statements so interesting." He turned, walking a few steps toward the jury before stopping. "Because, Officer Shaw, if Zariah Monroe was such a threat, if she was aggressive, violent, and reaching for your weapon, why is it that the body camera footage capturing all of this is conveniently missing?" The room went still. Shaw's lips parted slightly, but no words came. Zariah tilted her head ever so slightly, the corner of her mouth lifting just enough for him to see. She had him, and for the first time that night, Officer Shaw looked truly afraid. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as Zariah Monroe stood, adjusting the microphone before taking the stand. Her posture remained steady, her expression unreadable. But there was something in her eyes, something that made even the most skeptical spectators lean forward, sensing the shift in power. Her attorney, Tristan Wells, stepped closer. "Ms. Monroe, you've heard Officer Shaw's testimony. Is there anything you'd like to address?" Zariah took a slow breath, allowing the pause to stretch, her voice calm but firm. "Yes, almost everything he said was misleading." The reaction was immediate. A low murmur rippled through the gallery, forcing the judge to rap her gavel. Officer Shaw stiffened, his fingers curling into fists on the table. "Let's go back to the night in question," Wells continued. "Where were you when Officer Shaw approached you?" "I was standing outside Mason's Hardware," she answered, her voice unwavering. "I had just left a meeting nearby and was waiting for my rideshare." "And what happened next?" Zariah exhaled sharply, shaking her head slightly. "Officer Shaw pulled up, hit his siren, and got out of his car. He didn't ask if I needed help. He didn't introduce himself. He just shined a flashlight in my face and said, 'What are you doing here?'" Her tone shifted just enough to mimic Shaw's authoritative drawl, causing a stir in the crowd. The prosecutor, Lauren Mitchell, immediately stood. "Objection! Speculation!" Judge Camilla barely looked up. "Overruled. Continue." Zariah nodded. "I told him I was waiting for my ride. He didn't believe me. He kept circling me like I was a suspect, like I had no right to be there. And then he said, 'Women like you need to learn how to listen.'" The tension exploded. Gasps, whispers, one woman in the back even muttered, "Unbelievable." The judge rapped the gavel again. "Order." Mitchell, attempting damage control, interjected, "Miss Monroe, are you implying Officer Shaw was—" "I'm not implying," Zariah cut in. "I'm stating what happened." Wells took a step forward. "Zariah, at what point did the situation escalate? When I asked why he was questioning me, that's when his tone changed. He told me I was acting suspicious. He demanded my ID. I asked if I was being detained. He said, 'You are now.' Then he grabbed my arm." A sharp pause. Even the judge seemed to be holding her breath. "And did you resist?" Wells asked. Zariah locked eyes with Shaw. "Not at first. I told him to let go." He tightened his grip. "When I pulled back, he shoved me against the car and tried to cuff me. I asked what the charge was, and he said, 'Obstruction.'" Wells folded his hands. "And at any point did you reach for his weapon?" Her response was immediate. "No. That was a fabrication to justify his use of force." The jury absorbed the statement like a gut punch. Mitchell shot up again. "Objection, conclusion." But this time Wells was ready. "Your Honor, the prosecution allowed Officer Shaw to state under oath that Ms. Monroe attempted to seize his weapon. She has the right to respond." Judge Camilla considered this, then nodded. "Overruled." Mitchell sank back into her seat, visibly frustrated. Wells continued, "Zariah, do you have any proof that Officer Shaw's account isn't true?" Zariah let the silence build before delivering the final blow. His body camera conveniently malfunctioned at that moment. Another ripple of noise. Shaw shifted in his seat, jaw tightening. Mitchell, sensing the loss of control, stood again. Body cameras can fail for a variety of reasons. Zariah didn't even flinch. "Of course they can. But let's talk about how often they fail at key moments." She turned slightly, addressing the jury. "Let's talk about the pattern. Black men and women getting arrested on shaky charges. Officers justifying excessive force with 'I feared for my life,' or 'they reached for my weapon.' Body cameras that always seem to stop working when the truth could protect us." A heavy pause, a shift in the air. Even Judge Camilla seemed to acknowledge the weight of Zariah's words. Wells stepped in again. Zariah, if you had resisted, as Officer Shaw claims, could you have overpowered him? The courtroom went still. Even Mitchell hesitated. Zariah's lips pressed together, then parted slightly. If I had chosen to resist, she said slowly, this case wouldn't be happening. Because Officer Shaw wouldn't have walked away. Shaw flinched. The officers in the gallery exchanged nervous glances. The spectators braced themselves. Mitchell's face darkened. Are you threatening an officer of the law? No, Zariah said smoothly. I'm making a point. I have been trained in over a dozen combat techniques. I have spent years in situations where life and death depended on my ability to neutralize a threat. And I can tell you this, she turned back to the jury. If I had actually been trying to harm Officer Shaw, he wouldn't be sitting here lying under oath. He'd still be in recovery. The silence was deafening. Wells let it sit for a moment, then finally broke it with a quiet, measured voice. And yet, the only injury that night was to you. Zariah didn't nod, didn't even blink. Correct. Shaw looked down, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. Wells faced the judge. No further questions. The damage was done. The jury wasn't just hearing the truth, they were feeling it. Tristan Wells leaned forward, his sharp eyes locked on Zariah. The courtroom had been relentless, and though she had held her composure, he could sense something beneath the surface, something she wasn't telling him. Zariah, he said, his voice steady but firm. There's something you're holding back. I can feel it. I need the full truth if we're going to win this. Zariah exhaled slowly, leaning back in her chair. They were in her apartment now. Away from the prying eyes of the courtroom, away from the judging stares of those who had already made up their minds. Her place was neat, almost too neat. Books aligned perfectly, a single photo of her parents on the mantel. Nothing personal, nothing revealing. You ever served, Ben? She asked, her voice low. He shook his head. No, but my brother did. Marines. She gave a small nod, as if that answer was just enough. Then, with careful precision, she stood up, walked to a locked cabinet in the corner of the room, and pulled out a thick file. She placed it on the table between them. Ben's eyes flickered with curiosity as he opened it. The moment he saw the first page, his breath caught. Lieutenant Commander, Navy SEAL? His voice carried disbelief. He flipped through the documents. Combat deployments, commendations, classified operations, a silver star, a bronze star, a list of achievements that would make any soldier legendary. You've been sitting on this? He asked, looking up at her. Zariah folded her arms. If I had revealed it earlier, what do you think would have happened? Ben didn't answer immediately. He knew. The entire trial would have shifted from police brutality and racial profiling to whether or not Zariah was some kind of threat. The media would paint her as a trained killer instead of a victim. The prosecution would twist it, using her skills against her, making it seem like Officer Shaw was justified in his fear. You're right, he admitted, but Zariah, this changes everything. She nodded. I know, and that's why I need to control how and when it comes out. Ben let out a breath, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. All right, then tell me what happened that night. The real version. Zariah's expression hardened. I was walking back to my car after grabbing coffee at the diner. Shaw pulled up, lights flashing, and started questioning me like I was a criminal. I stayed calm. I answered his questions, but he kept pushing, said I was loitering, that I looked suspicious. Ben clenched his jaw. Let me guess he had his hand on his gun the whole time. Zariah gave a dry chuckle. Of course he did, and when I questioned why he was stopping me, his whole attitude shifted. He got aggressive, stepped into my space, shoved me against my car, told me women like you need to learn how to listen. Ben cursed under his breath. And then? I told him I wasn't resisting. I told him to check my ID. It was in my jacket pocket. He ignored that and went straight for the cuffs. When he tried to force my arm behind my back, I twisted out of his grip. Basic self-defense. That's when he panicked. He reached for his weapon, and that's when I froze. I knew if I moved the wrong way, he'd have an excuse to shoot. Ben closed his eyes for a second, steadying himself. And that's when he made up the story, that you tried to grab his gun. Zariah nodded. Exactly. Silence settled between them. Ben tapped the folder in front of him. This needs to come out, Zariah. Not to defend your actions, but to expose his lies. She hesitated. You think people will see it that way? Doesn't matter. The facts are on our side. Shaw thought he could get away with it because he assumed you were just another black woman with no power, no resources. He doesn't know who he messed with. We use this, and we don't just defend you, we destroy him. Zariah studied him for a long moment, then finally she gave a slow nod. All right, Ben, let's do it. The The air in the courtroom had already been tense, but as Tristan Wells stood and signaled to the Trevor, a new kind of energy settled over the space, anticipation. "Your Honor," Tristan said, his voice steady, deliberate. "The defense would like to present newly discovered video evidence." A ripple of murmurs swept through the spectators. Judge Camilla gave a sharp look over the rim of her glasses. "Proceed." The large courtroom screen flickered to life. The video was grainy, clearly taken from a cell phone, but the details were unmistakable. Officer Shaw, standing tall, his flashlight beam glaring in Zariah's face, his voice sharp, aggressive. "Women like you need to learn how to listen," he snapped. A gasp rippled through the gallery. The prosecution table stiffened. The video continued. Zariah, her hands visible, made no move toward him. But Shaw shoved her against the car anyway, yanking her arm behind her back. The pressure he used was excessive, deliberate. Her voice was calm, controlled. "I'm not resisting," she said. The next few seconds of the footage sealed it. Shaw stepped back, his hand hovering over his holster. But Zariah never reached for it, not once. Yet Shaw's voice rang out, clear as day. "Stop reaching for my gun!" A blatant, undeniable lie. The moment the video cut off, the silence was deafening. Then came the whispers, the disbelief, the outrage. At the prosecution's table, Shaw had gone rigid. His face was pale, a sheen of sweat forming at his temple. His fingers twitched against the polished wood of the table. He glanced at the DA, but no lifeline was coming. Tristan turned toward him, his expression unreadable. "Officer Shaw," he said, stepping forward, "would you care to explain what we just watched?" Shaw cleared his throat, his Adam's apple bobbing. The footage is incomplete," he stammered. "It doesn't show everything that happened." Tristan nodded. "You're right. It doesn't show everything. It doesn't show Zariah doing anything aggressive. It doesn't show her resisting. It doesn't show her reaching for your weapon." He let the words sink in before continuing. "But it does show you lying." The courtroom was completely still. Even Judge Camilla, who had remained neutral throughout the trial, leaned forward slightly. Shaw shifted uncomfortably. I was in the middle of a dangerous situation. I had to make a split-second decision." "A split-second decision?" Tristan cut in, his voice sharper now. "To lie on an official report? To claim a woman reached for your gun when she clearly didn't?" He stepped closer, locking eyes with Shaw. "Tell me, Officer Shaw, was it a split-second decision to falsely accuse a decorated war hero of a crime she didn't commit?" The words landed like a hammer. Shaw opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The room exploded in whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras flashed, and several officers in the back exchanged uneasy glances. Tristan let the weight of the moment settle before speaking again, his voice quieter, but no less commanding. "You see, Officer Shaw, the truth always comes out. No matter how much you try to manipulate it, no matter how much power you think you have." He turned back toward the jury, letting his gaze settle on each one. "We were told that Zariah Monroe was a threat, that she resisted, that she tried to grab a weapon. But what did we just see?" He gestured to the blank screen. A woman being harassed, pinned down, and falsely accused by the very person sworn to uphold the law. Shaw looked toward the prosecutor, desperation creeping into his features, but Dar Porter had already sunk into his chair, rubbing his forehead. He wasn't going to save him, not now. Tristan turned back to Shaw. "You lied under oath, you abused your authority, and you nearly destroyed an innocent woman's life in the process. But you didn't count on one thing, did you?" Shaw swallowed hard. "And what's that?" Tristan smiled just slightly. "That the truth would be recorded." Shaw had no response. His fingers curled into fists, his leg bounced under the table. The jury was watching, and they weren't buying his story anymore. Then the final blow came. Tristan turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, I move to have the charges against Zariah Monroe dropped immediately, on the grounds that the prosecution's key witness, Officer Shaw, has been proven unreliable and dishonest." The prosecutor shot up from his seat. "Your Honor, if I may." But Judge Camilla held up a hand, silencing him. She sat back in her chair, eyes narrowing at Shaw. "Officer Shaw," she said, her voice cool, calculated. "Would you like to change your statement before I consider the request?" Shaw hesitated, his jaw tightening. He glanced around, at the prosecutor, at the other officers in the room, at the jury whose expressions had shifted from neutral to something far more damning. Then, finally, he slumped slightly in his seat. I may have misinterpreted the situation," he muttered. The courtroom erupted. The judge banged her gavel. "Order!" But it was done. Shaw had cracked. Tristan turned back to Zariah. She met his gaze, and for the first time, her composed exterior wavered, just slightly, not in relief, not in victory, but in the weight of what had just been exposed. Because this wasn't just about her. It was about every person before her who hadn't been believed. Every person who hadn't had video proof. And now, finally, the truth was undeniable. The courtroom was still buzzing from the unraveling of Officer Shaw testimony. The weight of the truth had settled over the room like a heavy fog, undeniable, inescapable. But Zariah Monroe knew this fight wasn't over. Not yet. Statement. She rose from her seat with the same calm, deliberate movements that had carried her through years of combat. The judge, the jury, the prosecution, every set of eyes turned toward her as she stepped forward. Tristan gave her a small nod, stepping aside. This was her moment. Zariah took a deep breath and faced the jury. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady but charged with quiet intensity. "I won't take much of your time because by now you've seen the truth for yourselves." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. The room was so still she could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. "I have sat here and listened while my name was dragged through the mud. I have been painted as a violent, dangerous criminal, a threat. But what you saw today, the video, the contradictions in Officer Shaw's words tell a very different story." She let her gaze sweep across the jury, making sure to meet their eyes. Some looked back at her with quiet understanding, others with the discomfort of realizing just how wrong they had been. "I am not just a black woman sitting in this courtroom fighting for my freedom," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "I am a soldier, a veteran, a woman who dedicated her life to defending this country only to come home and be treated like a criminal because of the color of my skin." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Zariah pressed forward. "For 15 years, I served as a Navy SEAL. I trained, I fought, I led teams into situations most people can't even imagine. I made decisions under fire that determined whether my team lived or died. And I did it with honor." She took a step closer to the jury. "And yet, none of that mattered the night Officer Shaw decided I didn't belong in my own city." The tension in the room thickened. The officers in the back shifted uncomfortably. Shaw kept his head down, his face pale. "I have been in war zones," Zariah said, her voice sharp now. "I have faced real threats. And I can tell you this, what happened to me that night was not about law enforcement. It was about control. It was about power. It was about a man who thought he could lie, manipulate, and use his badge to crush another person simply because he could." She turned, looking directly at Judge Camilla. "I am not the first person this has happened to," she said. "But today, I refuse to be another statistic. I refuse to be another case file that gets buried while the next person suffers the same fate." The judge, who had remained composed throughout the trial, shifted slightly in her seat. Zariah turned back to the jury. "I am here today not just to fight for myself," she said, her voice ringing out clearly, "but to fight for every black man and woman who has been silenced, who has been told their word doesn't matter against a badge, who has been made to feel small, powerless, afraid." A single clap echoed from the back of the room, then another. The courtroom erupted into applause. Judge Camilla immediately banged her gavel. "Order!" she barked, but the energy in the room was electric. Zariah stood her ground, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted. She turned back to the jury one last time. "You have the power to set the record straight today," she said, "to make it clear that no one, no matter the uniform they wear, can abuse their authority and walk away untouched." She stepped back, her statement complete. For a moment, no one moved. The air itself seemed to crackle with the weight of what had just been said. Then Judge Camilla cleared her throat, adjusting her glasses. For the first time, there was a flicker of something in her expression. Respect. The district attorney, who had built his case around Shaw credibility, now sat stiffly, his hands folded on the table. He had no rebuttal, no comeback, no way to spin the undeniable. "The prosecution may present their final arguments," Judge Camilla announced. A long pause followed. The porter hesitated, then slowly stood. He cleared his throat, glancing toward Shaw, whose once proud posture had shrunk under the crushing weight of his own lies. "Your Honor," Porter started, though his voice lacked the confidence he had displayed earlier in the trial. Law enforcement officers make split-second decisions under pressure. They, Zariah's attorney Tristan, leaned forward. "Objection!" His voice was cool, controlled. "This isn't about split-second decisions. This is about a deliberate, calculated lie to cover up an abuse of power." Judge Camilla lifted a hand, silencing them both. "Sustained! Get to the point, Mr. Porter!" Porter looked down at his notes, then exhaled sharply. He had nothing left. No argument strong enough to convince the jury to ignore what they had just witnessed. "The prosecution rests, Your Honor," he muttered. A whisper spread across the courtroom like a wave. Even those who had entered the trial believing Shaw's story could now see the truth. Judge Camilla turned toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard all the evidence. You will now deliberate on your verdict." The Trevor stepped forward, preparing to escort the jury out. Zariah sat back down, exhaling slowly. Tristan leaned toward her. "That was powerful," he whispered. "You didn't just win over the jury, you changed the entire narrative." Zariah nodded, but she wasn't thinking about victory. She was thinking about every person who had never gotten this chance. Every black man and woman whose stories had been ignored, buried, dismissed. She had fought battles in war zones, but this was a war of a different kind. And today, she had won. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. The jury had been escorted out to deliberate, but the echoes of Zariah Monroe's testimony still hung heavy in the air. Officer Colton Shaw sat at the prosecution table, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned white. His once confident smirk had long since vanished. Now, his face was pale, his breathing uneven. He had come into this courtroom expecting an easy win. After all, he was a white police officer, and Zariah was just another black civilian, a woman he assumed no one would believe. But he had underestimated her. He had underestimated the power of the truth. And now his entire career, his entire identity was crumbling before his eyes. Porter, who had been so forceful at the start of this trial, cleared his throat and rose to his feet. He adjusted his tie, a nervous tic Zariah had noticed throughout the proceedings. He was scrambling now, struggling to regain control of a case that had spiraled out of his grasp. "Your Honor," Porter began, his voice thinner than before. "Law enforcement officers make split-second decisions under pressure. These are difficult, dangerous situations. Mistakes happen." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Zariah's attorney, Tristan Wells, slowly leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. He didn't object. He didn't need to. The jury had seen the evidence. They'd watched Shaw's lies unravel piece by piece. No well-rehearsed speech about split-second decisions was going to erase that. Porter shifted uncomfortably, realizing no one was convinced. He pressed forward anyway. "We ask that you consider the risks officers face every day," he continued, though his confidence was faltering. "Officer Shaw acted within the scope of his duties, his perception of the situation." Tristan stood. "Objection." His voice was calm, almost bored. "Perception doesn't change facts. The video evidence shows that Zariah Monroe did not at any point reach for his weapon. The only threat that night was the one sitting right over there." He gestured toward Shaw. Judge Camilla let out a long breath, then nodded. "Sustained. Mr. Porter, let's move along." Porter hesitated, then exhaled sharply. He had nothing left. "The prosecution rests, Your Honor." The whispering in the courtroom grew louder. Even those who had walked in believing Shaw's story could now see the truth, plain as day. Zariah sat still, her expression unreadable. But inside, she felt something shift. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every person who had been stopped, harassed, brutalized, and then blamed for it. This was about every name that had become a hashtag, every case that had been buried under technicalities and legal loopholes. This moment was bigger than her. She could feel it in the way the jury looked at her now. Not with suspicion, not with doubt, but with recognition, understanding. For once, the system had been forced to listen. Judge Camilla glanced toward the clock, then addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you will now deliberate on your verdict." The Trevor stepped forward, preparing to escort them out. But before they could leave, Shaw suddenly shot up from his seat. "This is ridiculous," he snapped, his voice cracking. "I was just doing my job." A gasp rippled through the room. Shaw turned toward Judge Camilla, his face flushed with desperation. "You're really going to let them ruin my career over this?" His gaze darted toward the jury, then the gallery. "This is what happens when we let people like her play the victim." Silence, heavy, unforgiving. Even Porter took a slow step back, as if realizing that Shaw had just dug his own grave. Judge Camilla's expression hardened. She leveled Shaw with a stare so cold the room seemed to drop a few degrees. "Officer Shaw," she said sharply, "sit down." For a moment, he didn't move, his jaw clenched, his hands twitching at his sides. Then, slowly, he sank back into his chair. The jury left, and the waiting began. Minutes passed, then an hour. The courtroom remained packed, buzzing with hushed conversations. Reporters scribbled notes. Camera crews waited outside, ready to capture the outcome of what had become a nationally followed trial. Then, finally, the jury returned. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Judge Camilla turned to the foreperson. Has the jury reached a verdict? A middle-aged black woman with streaks of grey in her hair stood. She held the verdict slip tightly, her expression unreadable. Yes, Your Honor, we have. The paper was passed to the judge. She read it over, her face betraying nothing. Then she handed it back. In the case of the City of Rochester versus Zariah Monroe, the foreperson said, her voice steady, we, the jury, find the defendant. The pause stretched, breathless. Not guilty on all counts. For a split second, there was no reaction. Then, the courtroom erupted. Cheers, gasps, even a few muffled sobs. Zariah closed her eyes, letting out a slow breath. Not guilty. She felt Tristan squeeze her shoulder. She turned to look at him, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she allowed herself to smile. The judge called for order, but the energy in the room was unstoppable. Zariah stood, turning toward the spectators, toward the journalists, the activists, the community members who had supported her. This was bigger than her, and they all knew it. As she gathered her things, Shaw sat frozen in his seat, his face hollow. He had spent years believing himself untouchable. That badge had given him power, and he had wielded it like a weapon. But today he had learned the truth. His power wasn't limitless, and now it was gone. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Microphones were shoved toward her, questions thrown in every direction. Zariah, how do you feel about the verdict? What do you say to those who still defend Officer Shaw? Do you plan to take legal action against the Rochester Police Department? Zariah held up a hand, silencing the noise. Then, looking directly into the cameras, she spoke. I fought for this country because I believed in justice, she said. Today, I fought for justice again. Not just for myself, but for every black man and woman who has been silenced. She took a breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This isn't just about one case. This is about change. With that, she turned and walked away. The cameras flashed. The reporters shouted. But Zariah Monroe had said everything that needed to be said. And now, the world was listening.